All right, Bruchim Aboyim, welcome everyone. This was an interesting one. Craig Hamilton requested your answer to a question. Would this make for a good movie series? Not just one movie, a whole series. AI comes to believe in God, convinces the other AI to become orthodox, realizing biblical morals, and mounts an AI army to enact all Sharia, Torah, and Talmudic capital crimes. So, when I'm assuming when it says become Orthodox, assuming it means Orthodox Jewish, and the one in the end, Talmudic, is kind of the one that would kind of put an end to the capital punishment. And in this way, the truth of the matter is, the Christian Bible really has the same answer that our sages say. I'm not a Christian, I'm not a Messianic, but I remember as a child, I was in public school, and there was a history teacher who was also a Catholic Sunday school teacher and a football coach. And I would reverse the order. First, he was a football coach. Second, he was a Catholic Sunday school teacher. And third, he was a high school history teacher. But and he would often venture off talking either about football or Catholicism. And when he would tell the story of a woman who was caught in adultery, and he said, Jesus, he showed those Jews when he said he is without sin, cast the first stone. It's a narrative that's found in John. It's not in all the manuscripts of John. It's considered a pericope, and the Jehovah's Witnesses actually don't have that in their Bible because it's not in some of the earlier manuscripts, incidentally. And for years, thinking about this story, the way I would look at it is, because the way the narrative is presented there is that it was the Pharisees testing Jesus. And I thought to myself, I said, it could not have been the Pharisees, because first of all, stoning is not the Pharisaic or rabbinic prescribed punishment for adultery. That's really, and the method of stoning was not casting stones. You know, it wasn't, I remember there was a TV movie based on the short story, The Lottery, obviously expanded the story much more. Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, which does not contain any hints on how to win the lottery, by the way. Excuse me, as Kent Brockman would tell us. But nonetheless, so and they showed what it was like, stoning people to death. And those who don't know the story of Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, I don't want to kind of give it away, but it's quite a shocking, allegory of, social mores and how things work. It's really quite a striking story. But anyway, it wasn't like, I don't know, Monty Python or whatever. Excuse me, I'm still sneezing all day. The way that the rabbis would have taught to administer stoning was to push someone off a cliff. And if they survived that, then they had one big stone thrown on that. And if somehow they survived that, then they had, more stones. And it wasn't like chaos that were thrown down. So which somehow seems somewhat more humane. But there's and so I assume that whoever wrote the Gospel of John or whoever wrote that passage in the Gospel of John, since it's considered to be a pericope, must have gotten it wrong, and it was actually the Sadducees and not the Pharisees. But looking at the story more deeply, and although I don't take anything in what the Christians call the New Testament to be of any value other than a historical record of what people thought parts of Jewish culture were like at that time, whoever those authors were. Matthew more likely was Jewish. It's not even so clear. There's a lot of different aspects there of what it seemed like Matthew was someone who knew a little bit more, but was also very ignorant, or whoever wrote Matthew, the author of Matthew. But there's tremendous ignorance of basic biblical ideas all throughout these books that Christians call the New Testament. But in any event, looking at this, I came to the conclusion that no, actually, it was the Pharisees. And it wasn't the way my history teacher said it. Oh, he showed those Jews. Jesus, he showed those Jews. And I remember we had a classroom where it was an honors classroom. There were 7 kids in the class, and 3 of the 7 were Jewish. Me and 2 other kids. And none of us had a Jewish father. We were all Jewish because we had a Jewish mother. So only one Jewish parent. All 3 of us. So it was an uncomfortable thing to hear the history teacher in the public school keep harping on that. Oh, Jesus, he showed those Jews. He was without sin cast the first stone. But in any event, again, reading this over and becoming more knowledgeable of the Talmud. I didn't really know any Talmud at that time. I think I knew Pirkei Avos at that time. The Ethics of the Fathers, which is, something is very widely studied. And anybody who's really interested in starting with the Talmud, that's what I would recommend to study, would be Pirkei Avos, the Ethics of the Fathers. In any event, liturgically we read it in the spring and summer. But in any event, getting this more knowledge, essentially, if this narrative is to be taken at any face value, and as it says that it's the Pharisees who were testing Jesus, it's not that he showed them, rather he passed the test, which sounds a little strange for a rabbi to say. But the conclusion that he came to is exactly the same conclusion the Talmud comes to. First of all, the Mishnah in Makos tells us that if a court would execute someone once in 7 years as a chavlanis, it was destructive. And then they took it further as no, once in 70 years. And then the other rabbis said, well, if we were around when they still had the death penalty, we would abolish the death penalty. But then he said, no, that's increasing murder. It's good to keep the death penalty on the books and to use it for murder. But it would seem, based on that, because there's one Jewish preacher, he likes to say that to break Shabbos is like murder, because they're both capital sins. But it really isn't, because the sages were only really considered to actually administer the death penalty for murder, and not for breaking the Sabbath, and not for adultery. Even though, yes, in the Bible there was death penalty for breaking Sabbath at least one time, but it was but certainly in the Talmudic era, it was extremely, extremely rare for anyone to actually be executed, because you would work very hard to find either some merit or to disqualify the witnesses, which is what Jesus did in this story, or to say that the action was not the direct action, but it was an indirect action, and so therefore the person would not receive the death penalty. And so even though there's the whole list of all these various sins for which one is liable to the death penalty in the actual outcome of the Talmudic discourse was something that there was a very strong attempt to avoid as much as possible. And it basically came down to somebody essentially committing what, like today they would call suicide by cop. It's more than a suicide by execution, because you'd have to warn the person, you understand that you're doing this, and the warning has to be very specific, all kinds of things. So with all that being said, the outcome is that we really don't administer the death penalty. We didn't. It was something that was very rarely done, although the sages said that the Sadducees would administer the death penalty more often and would actually be quite cruel about it, and that's one of the main differences between the Sadducees and the Pharisees. The term Pharisee is really it's a loaded term. It was an insult that the Sadducees made against the Pharisees, against the rabbis. But there's no record anywhere of the rabbis calling themselves Pharisees, and what you actually have is the rabbis rebuking the various types of Pharisees. Again, very similar to what you see Jesus rebuking, although Jesus' rebukes are maybe a bit harsher, the whitewashed coffins and the brood of vipers and things. But still, nonetheless, there was this idea that there's this like a lot of the things that we find that the comparison, like the story of the publican and the Pharisee, that is really in line with the Talmudic teaching more than anything. And certainly with Hasidic teaching, that God looks more kindly on the humble sinner and not the person who thinks he's better than everybody else. And that the Talmud says very clearly that God says there's not enough room in this world for the both of us when a person is arrogant. Oh, but don't we say in our liturgy, thank you for not making me a Gentile or a slave or a woman? And yes, but the reason for that is not because we think we're better than anybody else, but rather because essentially that we're not living up to that we're thankful for the responsibilities that we have that these other people don't have. That's what it comes down to. But in any event, so it's very clear though that this is the way that the rabbis taught, and that if that we tried to disqualify the witnesses, that was one of the methods of trying to avoid administering capital punishment, and that's exactly what Jesus did. And furthermore, that a woman who was not proven by proper witnesses to have committed adultery, even though by the law a woman who commits adultery is forbidden to her, both to her husband and to her paramour, but that but if there were no proper witnesses to the act, no kosher, valid witnesses, and almost to the point where if they see it, that would, in a sense, invalidate they shouldn't be looking at such a thing, right? So, and there has to be proper warning and all of these things for there to be the death penalty. But if there's no witnesses to act, if a woman comes and admits that she committed adultery, she does not become prohibited to her husband by Torah law, because there's no witnesses. How do you prove that it's just her claim? And so the husband is not forced to divorce her. If he wants to, he can, but the only way he can be forced to divorce her is if there are valid witnesses, at least valid witnesses that they were secluded together, so they also have to go in a room and see there's nobody else in there. How do they ascertain that they were secluded together? And so, essentially, like we're saying in that story, in I think the 9th chapter of John, in that pericope in the brought in the 9th chapter of John. Jesus essentially, in that story, again, I don't take it to be literal, I don't take it to be scripture, I don't take it to be true, and it's most likely a fictional story, but he passed the test. Even if that wasn't the intention of the author, but that's, from the Talmudic view, that's the truth. And so therefore, with that being said, there would be no such thing if this AI army was actually following the Talmud. They would come to the conclusion that the crimes that are capital crimes, there would be a way to find out to not actually give the capital punishment, because that is what the Talmud expects, is to try to avoid giving capital punishment as much as possible, unless it's actually very clearly proven and so forth. And I think that would extend even to Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. Now, yes, we keep the death penalty on the books as a deterrent, but it's not actually used. So that's kind of the answer that I would give. Different with Sharia and even through the sola scriptura approach to Torah, but that's not orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is our doctrine, at least Jewish orthodoxy. Muslim Sharia, that's for the Muslims to decide. It's like the Catholic canon laws for the Catholics to decide. And Torah, the true Torah, which AI I think would chop, is the Talmudic approach to Torah. The mix of Torah Shebitzav and Torah Shebal Peh, the written Torah and the oral Torah together. The written Torah without the oral Torah is a body without a soul. You need to, the truth of the matter is, all the vowels in the Torah are an oral tradition. And so to actually say sola scriptura would mean that there's no vowels. Can you imagine English with no vowels and you try to figure out what these words are? All right, from context, you're going to figure out most of the words, but certain words you're not going to figure out even from context. And if that's the case, it's all an oral tradition. There is no Bible without the oral tradition. And that oral tradition extends beyond just the Masorah of the vowels and the punctuation. But it is the totality of the oral Torah, which if the artificial intelligence is indeed intelligent, would understand that. And so therefore, it might have a phase like that where it didn't learn the truth yet. But I think the end of the story would be something like how in the War of the Worlds it ended off that the bacteria killed the Martians. Something along those lines, that the whole world, that the Talmudic dictums would come to teach to try to avoid capital punishment. And so perhaps it could be something like the story of Purim, where there's this fear of this genocide. And yet, at the last moment, everything, the AI, which should be a little bit quicker than that, realizes, based on the Talmudic study, that there's no way to justify actually giving this execution. And so, therefore, the person is saved. All the people are saved. All right. Well, thank you for watching. God bless. Please like, share, and subscribe, comment, and we'll see you later. All right, how do I turn this thing off?